Okay, well, I suggest we start things off. A few people may creep in late, but that's the norm with LSE lectures. Well, first of all, welcome. It's an honour and a privilege to chair the event tonight. What we're going to do is I'm going to sort of say one or two words of welcome, then I'm going to pass over to my colleague Andreas from the German Historical Institute, who will also say a few words. Then I'll introduce our speaker, and then the preliminaries are over and you get into the main course, which is Professor Rödder's lecture. So perhaps if I hand over straight away now to you, Professor Gestrich, then I'll do the introductions.
Well, good evening. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to our fourth inaugural lecture within the framework of the Gerda Henkel Visiting Professorship Program, which the LSE runs jointly with the German Historical Institute. And I would just like to take the opportunity this evening to, first of all, thank the Gerda Henkel Stiftung, who is represented by Dr. Angela Kuhn this evening here, for having supported this program for 4 years now. And this has been, from the perspective of both institutes, for us a great success. Its input into the LSE, the visiting professor has not a year off, but he has to teach a course in the master's program at the LSE, and otherwise he resides at the German Historical Institute and is supposed to write a book and organize a conference. So it's not holidays, but it's a relaxed atmosphere where one can actually, I hope, get a lot done. And this is really due to the very gracious support of the Gerda Henkel Stiftung. And I, of course, hope that this will going to continue the program, which we will see later on this month. So, and it's a great pleasure for me here to welcome Andreas Rödder. We share a long past together. We were both at the University of Stuttgart, and so it's very nice Andreas, to have you here and to see you here again for a long period of time. A year is quite a bit, 12 months. So, excellent. Well, thank you for coming, and all of you, and I hand over to Piers.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you, Andreas. And let me first of all echo the what was already said about thanking both the German Historical Institute, who are our sort of co-hosts of both this event and of Professor Rödder's year in London, and still more importantly, the Gerda Henkel Stiftung, who pay for it. So it's a collaboration which I think has genuinely brought a great deal. Often with visiting professorships, the visiting professor can be a slightly detached person in the department that they are visiting. I certainly found that in my own time spent at Princeton. But the idea of having somebody actually teaching in the department, I think, plugs that person into the department in a way that is relatively original, but I think very, very valuable for us as a department, and I hope also for the visiting professors themselves, although that's clearly something I leave for them to judge. Okay, well, tonight it's a huge pleasure to welcome Professor Rödder and to introduce his introductory lecture. I felt, as always when I go through the CVs of other academics, but it must be said particularly German academics, sort of slightly, well, I couldn't quite work out whether I was annoyed or scared by how broad the list of writings were. Professor Rödder has written on Stresemann, but he's also written on 19th century British conservatives. He's written on post-war Germany, and also a more detailed study of German reunification. Indeed, we will be collaborating on a project revisiting German reunification in the months ahead, which I look forward to greatly. This remarkable breadth is in a sense continued with the basic project that you are here to do, and which you'll probably be you may mention tonight, which is entitled The History of the Present Age, which is a very ambitious undertaking. But tonight's lecture continues the theme of breadth by taking an ambitiously large span of German history and looking, as the title in front of you shows, at the German question on the European stage from Kaiser Wilhelm to Chancellor Merkel, particularly appropriate perhaps to be delivered on the day that Merkel was in town to see David Cameron. So, that's probably quite enough of me, so without further ado, I'll hand you straight over to tonight's speaker, Professor Andreas Rödder.
Thanks to you, Piers. Thanks to you, Andreas, for the very warm and friendly welcome. Thanks to the German Historical Institute, thanks to the LSE, thanks to the Gerda Henkel Foundation for giving me the extraordinary privilege of staying here for 1 year, which just has begun, and there are still 11 months left. I'm counting every day which is left. And thanks to you all for coming and attending tonight and sharing with me some deliberations I would like to present on the German question on the European stage. I am sitting down. This was towering Helmut Kohl's answer to Margaret Thatcher's snub. Sit down, you big German, you are making everyone very nervous. This is at least how this cartoon in the Montreal Gazette in 1990 saw it. Es sind die alten Ängste, es sind die alten Animositäten. Kohl told his party board in Germany, the old fears, the old animosities, and these were indeed Thatcher's. Notorious is the excursus in her memoirs. Since the unification of Germany under Bismarck, she writes there, Germany has veered unpredictably between aggression and self-doubt. A reunited Germany is simply too big and powerful to be just another player within Europe. Thatcher's dictum, Germany is simply too big and too powerful, strikingly resembles German historian Ludwig de Hio's assertion of Germany's half-hegemonial position in post-1871 Europe, published shortly after the Second World War. Too weak to really dominate the continent, but too strong to simply be subordinate. In Germany, this manner of speaking has become widely obsolete. Germans are convinced that they have been merged into Europe. You might know the catchphrase, anybody designating himself as a European already has revealed himself as a German. This again resembles Thatcher's assertions about German politics in the 1980s and their desire to, as she wrote, merge their national identity in a wider European one. In effect, the Germans, she writes, because they are nervous of governing themselves, want to establish a European system in which no nation will govern itself. Such a system could only be unstable in the long term and, because of Germany's size and preponderance, is bound to be lopsided. Obsession with a European Germany risks producing a German Europe. So far, Thatcher. However, Chancellor Merkel needed 7,000 security police, not today in London, but when she visited Greece in October, and demonstrators accosted her with swastikas and Hitlergruß, a public reception worse than Kaiser Wilhelm's, even without sending gunships to Agadir, just demanding conditions for economic help. German hegemony as a result of European integration? This would be the exact opposite of the German experience from the age of world wars, that it is following interest regardless of international requirements, that it is the lack of international integration which leads into German isolation. German isolation, one German trauma of its 20th century history. This obvious predicament leads to the underlying question which shall serve as the first guiding idea of this talk, carving out patterns and traditions of the German half-hegemony in Europe, accompanied by a second question, the question for the political handling of this scenario, particularly by the Germans themselves. Tonight I would like to present the German question on the European stage in 3 acts, not as an encyclopedic overview, but as a selection of specific aspects. First, a couple of short observations from Kaiser Wilhelm to Chancellor Kohl in terms of national interests and international integration, a story that, regardless of German partition in the 1980s, was increasingly told as the completed story of Germany's final Western integration. But when German reunification burst into history, things were to change fundamentally, and the German question in a post-Cold War Europe came up again. Thus, the second act will present a bit more detailed empirical analysis of the connection between German reunification and European integration, trying to give an answer to the controversial question, was the European Monetary Union, was the euro, the price Germany had to pay for reunification? Thatcher's view was quite the opposite. She did not understand the introduction of the euro as a concession in order to include Germany into Europe, but she saw it, at least in effect, as a means of creating a German Europe. This leads then to the final but comparatively brief act following the question of the half hegemony and its handling from 1990 to the present euro crisis and to Angela Merkel, telling the story of the supposed German fall and rise again, and finally trying to figure out political courses of action. Before we now turn to the Kaiserreich, 2 preliminary remarks regarding national interests. When I repeatedly refer to this category, this does not mean that national interests should be anything pre-existent or given. Rather, national interests are due to definition and negotiation, to political and cultural change. Even so, we can observe remarkable continuities beyond short-term political changes in what are regarded and pursued as respective national interests. A preponderance of mercantilist-based social politics, national self-assertion and containment of Germany in French politics, for example, and in West Germany, a rather consistent interest in international security through Western integration and in political as well as economic stability, avoiding further inflation, the other German trauma besides isolation. This leads to the second remark. Post-1945 West German national interests, as I use the term, do not refer to the national question in the narrower sense of a German reunification, but to the basic guidelines of the Federal Republic's politics already mentioned, while we can probably ignore the GDR when pursuing the question of German dominance in Europe. On 9th of February 1871, Benjamin Disraeli told the House of Commons with regard to the Franco-Prussian War, "This war represents the German Revolution, a greater political event than the French Revolution of the last century. The balance of power has entirely been destroyed. Destroyed by 3 wars generating unified German empire in the middle of Europe, holding a half hegemony in terms of military as well as political strength. Yet what Bismarck, the white revolutionary and destroyer of the European order of 1815, did after 1871 was try to rebuild and to stabilize the balance of power in Europe, even at the price of relinquishing further gains of power at a time when standstill was identified as setback. Bismarck's idea, according to the Kissinger dictation of 1877, his idea was the idea not of acquiring territories, even if he did so in some cases, but of a political constellation, Bismarck wrote, in which all powers, apart from France, are in need of German support and therefore reluctant to build coalitions against Germany. In doing so, Bismarck was driven by the awareness of unequal standards in Europe after the founding of the Kaiserreich. Unequal standards not in any legal terms, but in terms of international politics. The European powers would not permit Germany to gain any more power, but considered that they themselves were entitled to do so. This is the first general finding, and it was this awareness of unequal perceptions and different standards of what was considered legitimate that the Wilhelmine Weltpolitik abandoned, when the Kaiserreich, moreover, became the technological and economic powerhouse within Europe in late 19th century. When Under-Secretary of State Bernhard von Bülow claimed a German place in the sun too, he thought he was stressing the two. But what Germans considered as a matter of equal rights appeared as aspirations for hegemony to others, based in a, I quote, deeply rooted feeling that Germany has, by the strength and purity of her national purpose, the high standard of competency, and the perspicuous honesty of her administration, the successful pursuit of every branch of public and scientific activity, and the elevated character of her philosophy, art, and ethics, established for herself the right to assert the primacy of German national ideas. It was not Anthony Samaras who wrote this in 2012, but Err Crow in 1907. Thus, what we observe is not only German vigor, but at the same time, obviously deep-rooted patterns of perception and suspicion of German hegemonic aspirations. I don't want to get deeper now into the thrilling trends in recent research on pre-1914 international politics, which stress much more the contribution of others, not only of Germany. However, what will remain as a historical factor, I think, is Wilhelmine's Germany's handling of this situation, of its self-perceived inalienable rights, regardless of others' perspectives and perceptions, a lack of awareness of its own strengths as international compatibility. This is the second finding, which helped lead Germany into its much deplored isolation. If this led into war, it did not disappear with it. The art of expressing gratitude is one which Germans do not practice. British Ambassador Lord Daybonen wrote in his diary in November 1925, and he continued, "Directly they are granted anything, they not only ask for more, but criticize what has been given as inadequate satisfaction to their unquestionable rights." Gustav Stresemann himself confirmed that this was no mere misperception. My impression is, Stresemann said, that the Germans have too little or don't even have any appreciation for what the French call the nice touch. And this damages us heavily in foreign politics. We can't pursue world politics with the notion nobody shall join these Muppets. Thus, this is Stresemann's specific line in interwar German foreign politics. In the beginning of a German tradition in the 20th century, third general observation, the attempt to combine national interest, in this case the revision of the Versailles Treaty, with international rapprochement, a feeling for the other's perspectives, and particularly for French needs. Given the conditions of interwar Germany, there was no chance to enforce this sustainably due to a prevailing culture of unconditionality. In a nutshell, one day the young, later famous conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler was out with his teacher, the archaeologist Ludwig Curtius, on a walking tour, when Curtius told Furtwängler that he estimated the devoutness of Bach's Mass in B minor higher than that of Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. If this is true, Furtwängler answered, we can't walk together any longer. So regarding the relationship of national politics and international integration, as well as the question of hegemony, the case of National Socialist Germany is so obvious, and since we had Sönke Neitzel's impressive talk last week, that there is no real need to mention the war tonight. After 1945, a completely different raison d'etre of West German foreign politics was established, which political scientists have called gaining sovereignty by abandoning sovereignty. However, given that the Allies had assumed supreme authority with respect to Germany, as the Berlin Declaration of the 5th of June 1945 claimed, at first there was little to abandon and much to regain. Thus, this pattern was at the core of the European Community of Coal and Steel founded in 1951. The Europeanization, at least in the Europe of six, of basic resources of power, in this case of heavy industry, allowed emancipation among Western nations and founded a tradition of German self-inclusion, accompanied by a deep-seated self-distrust in the Germans, as well as in the traditional German nation-state, and accompanied by subordinating the national interest of national unity. The same is true of the German accession to NATO, and this specific combination of West German interests and international integration worked at least until the Guadeloupe summit in 1979, as Christina Spohr recently has convincingly shown, when Helmut Schmidt, as Chancellor of non-nuclear West Germany, appeared as an equal member of a Western Directorate of Four. However, with increasing German emancipation and with its increasing economic power, at least its relative strength, international integration started to get into conflict with its national interests. This became obvious in the late 80s, on the one hand by means of security politics. West German government had subordinated national unity to the Western guarantee of security since the 50s, and Helmut Kohl in particular had shown strong loyalty to NATO in the missile crisis of the early 80s. But when the superpowers abandoned the intermediate range nuclear forces under the INF Treaty in 1987, leaving just short range nuclear forces in Europe, which NATO pressed to modernize, Germans began to resist, one of the arguments being the shorter the range, the deader the Germans. A nascent conflict was finally superseded by the European revolutions of 1989, but it had started to indicate and to pose new questions about the German position within the Western alliance and the German role in Europe. This applies particularly to another serious problem, the strength of German economy. German economy performed by far the strongest amongst European economies in the 80s, including Lawson booming England. While Germany managed to create economic prosperity without comparable social collateral damage, the Bundesbank fought the risk of inflation by applying high interest rates, thus putting pressure on other European economies. Kohl realized that German economic success revealed a formidable reverse, as he said in 1989, serious, very serious psychological dislocations. François Mitterrand's advisor Jacques Attali put it even more clearly. German power relies on its economy, Attali wrote, and the D-Mark is Germany's nuclear bomb. Thus, the founding of the European Monetary Union became a pivotal moment in the history of Germany and Europe. This now leads us to the second question and the second act. Did Germany sacrifice its weapon of mass destruction for the sake of German reunification as a precondition for gaining French approval? This, at least, has often been maintained and is still a widely accepted opinion. Let's use this as a starting point for a bit more detailed investigation into the relation between German reunification and the introduction of the European Monetary Union, both of which were accomplished between 1988 and 1992. If there was a connection between German reunification and the European Monetary Union, it was the Strasbourg summit in December 1989, when Mitterrand and the members of the European Council maintained the Germans' right to self-determination and reunification, whereas Kohl agreed to start the Intergovernmental Conference for the European Monetary Union. We will return to that, but we first need to go back, since Strasbourg was not the beginning of the Monetary Union. Its origins were pre-1989, and they resided, as we have seen, in the power of the German economy and the strength of the Deutschmark, vis-à-vis the 3 times devaluated franc in the 80s. And it resided in the corresponding French aspirations to get their hands on the German atomic bomb. This was at the same time part of a broader process, the relaunch of West European integration from the mid-80s onwards, overcoming the so-called Eurosclerosis of the late 70s and evolving a new European order as the bipolar world order crumbled. This process increasingly saw West Germany and France as the driving forces, along with Jacques Delors' European Commission. The European Monetary Union figured as a key element in this process, even if for contemporaries it was overshadowed by the East European revolutions. The first of 4 major steps was taken when the European Council established a committee under the guidance of Jacques Delors at the Hanover summit in June 1988. The trick was to include the main critics, the central bank presidents, particularly the fundamentally skeptical president of the German Bundesbank. What Thatcher and others hoped would destroy the idea of a common currency, in the end ensnared the critics. This first step towards European monetary union thus reveals a basic European experience. A process once set up develops path-dependent dynamics. At least, steps once taken are not easily reversed. The second step, then, was the adoption of the committee's report by the European Council in Madrid in late June 1989. The report suggested that the monetary union be introduced in 3 stages, and it was agreed to start the first one, providing free capital transfer, in July 1990. However, the crucial second and third stages, the establishment of a central bank and of fixed exchange rates, were assigned to an intergovernmental conference, and when this conference should take place, was left open to discussion and decision. This decision to start the intergovernmental conference, the third major step towards EMU, thus became the crucial issue in Franco-German relations, which were deteriorating badly in the late year of 1989. The German position was to do preparatory work first and to take the decision on the Intergovernmental Conference 1 year later. The German government thus gave priority to stability politics, and at the same time it wanted to establish a political union, even if its final aim and shape was not entirely clear. Mitterrand regarded these German propositions as mere delaying tactics, suspecting that the Germans were tiptoeing away from the monetary union. As Kohl's advisor Bitterlich observed, EMU was the preeminent objective for the remaining years of Mitterrand's presidency. Thus, Mitterrand, with a much more strategic approach than Kohl and the Germans, pressed for a decision that the intergovernmental conference should definitely start within 1 year. Mitterrand gave priority to establishing the institutions of the monetary union, while he slowed down the initiatives towards a political union. Margaret Thatcher, by the way, basically rejected a monetary as well as a political union, thereby by staying offside the European integration push towards a post-Cold War European order. So far, all this has been told without mentioning the question of German reunification. The German question came into play after the fall of the wall. It gained momentum in late November 1989 and intertwined with the preparation for the European Council in Strasbourg on the 8th of December. Mitterrand considered it as perfidious that Kohl not only sent him a draft timetable on 27th of November, disregarding French ideas by suggesting that preparatory work should start in Strasbourg and the decision on the intergovernmental conference should be taken not before 1 year later. Mitterrand was even more upset when Kohl scored a coup 1 day later by publicly announcing his 10 points leading to German reunification and thereby setting the German question on the international agenda without consulting Paris or any other power in advance. The French president decided to teach German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher a lesson. The notes of their encounter on the 30th of November emphasize Mitterrand's insistent repetitions, and this time the notorious Sphinx left no doubt about the message. If Western European integration stops, Mitterrand told Genscher, it will decline. If it declines, the European conditions will face fundamental changes and new and privileged alliances will arise. It would even be possible to fall back into the mindscape of 1913. Still, Kohl's advisor and the Chancellery recommended that he stick to the German position of stability politics. But on the 5th of December, Kohl weakened. He agreed that the Strasbourg Council should take the decision to start the intergovernmental conference within 1 year. This decision, then taken in Strasbourg, marks the closest connection between the German reunification and European monetary union. Kohl, driven by Genscher, clearly was the dominant German politician in European integration politics in the late 80s and in the 90s, a momentous process that was conducted by a very small circle of political and administrative elites anyway. In Strasbourg, Kohl agreed to proceed with the third of 4 major steps towards European monetary union faster and further than he would have done without pressures in the wake of his 10 points program and due to impending German reunification. Thus, the first assertion is German reunification did not bring about the European monetary union, but German reunification accelerated it and brought it closer to the French concept by subordinating a political union to the monetary union and by giving priority to establishing institutions instead of safeguarding stability first. However, this is not the whole story, since there is an underlying consensus on original German principles which shaped the Maastricht Compromise, which then marked the 4th major step. the acceptance, the European acceptance of German so-called stability politics as a quid pro quo for German acceptance of the European Monetary Union. The consensus on an independent central bank with stability of prices as its primary objective, and finally the Euro Stability Pact of 1979, which sought to perpetuate obligatory budgetary discipline for all members of the European Monetary Union. The Strasbourg decision was a political decision. 3 days later, Kohl told the American Foreign Secretary James Baker, what could he do more than to support the establishment of an economic and monetary union? He, he's talking about himself, Kohl, took this decision, as he said, against German interests. But it is politically important since Germany needs friends. Even if Kohl might have addressed this ad personam in order to stress his goodwill in view of the accelerating events in Germany and his heavily criticized pressing ahead with the 10 points, even though this is a noteworthy remark, at least it reveals that, as Kohl himself was aware, the decision for the monetary union was taken against serious economic objections in terms of stability, as they were articulated by the German Bundesbank or by economic experts, referring to the unfulfilled requirements of an optimal currency area. However, since even Nobel Prize-honored economists tend to claim as eternal truth what turns out to be entirely inapplicable the next day, they make it easy for politicians to despise economists' advice. The crucial problem lay in enduring political and cultural differences between France and Germany, even more between the northern and southern countries of the European Monetary Union, which went beyond mere prejudice. And even if we might recall Edmund Burke's qualification of prejudice as wisdom without reflection. However, analysis of respective discourses and argumentation patterns reveals indeed fundamental differences. Where German politics rely on the liability of treaties, even if the Germans themselves, Wotan-like, broke them in 2004, French politicians give primacy to politics. Where the Germans bank on monetary stability, the French give primacy to social politics. And where the German trauma is inflation, the French trauma is the Germans. Those differences lie at the core of how the present euro debt crisis is dealt with, and Kohl was aware of them at the outset. But in the end, and mocking Thatcher, he nonchalantly put them aside, as revealed by the report to his party board just recently published. The phrase, I quote Kohl, that the Italians conceive the rules, the French shape them, and the Germans obey them, he said in 1995, this is part of the European charm. Optimistic about a Europe on the basis of subsidiarity, thereby underestimating the powerful undercurrent of integration, Thatcher described Kohl's attitude as follows. Kohl seemed willing to subordinate German interests to French guidance, since this reassured Germany's neighbors. So far Thatcher. But this is not so far away from the German Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle, who stated a couple of weeks ago, German and European interests go hand in hand. This equaling of German and European interests in fact means, as we have seen, giving priority to European integration and, at least partially, subordinating national interests. This leads to my second assertion, with reunification at the latest. For German political elites, European integration has taken on a life of its own. This has been accompanied and confirmed by narratives and communication strategies, by stigmatizing critics as Eurosceptics and ruling them out of the political discourse in the 90s, or by claiming Tina, there is no alternative. The alternative to the monetary union, Kohl said in 1990, again towards his party board, the alternative to the monetary union, I quote him, is back to Kaiser Wilhelm, and that doesn't help us. This was one way of using history as a political argument, and here this talk links up with David Stephenson's formidable lecture 2 weeks ago. Even more effective in this regard was the immunizing narrative of peace. The story of European self-civilization after 1945, to quote Tony Judd, as a perpetual legacy of integration. Let's listen to Kohl, to his party board, for a last time. Building the European house, irreversibly incorporating its by far most powerful country, Germany. This is, Kohl said, the question of war and peace in the 21st century. This is what German social philosopher Hans Joas has just recently called the sacralization of European integration. It marks a fundamental reversal of Wilhelmine lack of awareness of others. The blatant contrast with widespread international perceptions of German politics now lead us to some concluding remarks to sum up in the shorter third part. German history since 1871 reveals a recurring predominance of its economic and material potential in Europe, and this against all setbacks: 2 lost world wars, the expulsion and extermination of its Jewish elites, the loss of 1/3 of its territory, the twofold Europeanization of its principal power resources, and finally the alleged overload by the reconstruction of the new Länder after 1990. The aftermath of reunification witnessed manifold and widespread analysis of heavily over-industrialized Germany's inevitable decline. This talk is less than 10 years old. For a couple of years now, however, particularly since the onset of the financial crisis, the allegedly sick man of Europe has arisen like a phoenix from the ashes. Germany is up again, and talk of the German model is back, as are suspicions of German European politics camouflaging national interests and in reality promoting German supremacy. Now, is this an appropriate view? In my opinion, this not only overestimates German capacities for strategy, but it misses the core with regard to motives as well as effects. The recent German recovery is primarily the result of reforms carried out by the Social Democratic and Green Rödder government to improve German productivity and competitiveness, in accordance with the Maastricht Consensus, and at the same time reinforcing exactly those problems of economic disparities that should have been ruled out by the monetary union. The euro has not diffused the German atom bomb, perhaps even enhanced it. Obviously, the German problem in Europe remains a structural problem of German economic power, irrespective of EU and European monetary union. If this is true, the German question is still a matter to be dealt with. The German Kaiserreich provides historical experience that, different from a hegemonic power, inward-looking unawareness of foreign perceptions and unequal standards, as well as unawareness of others' needs and international demands, lead into isolation. Post-1945, West Germany witnessed the benefits of combining its own interests with international integration, even if in cases of conflict, precedence had to be given to international requirements. When this was stretched to its limits in the 80s, and particularly after German reunification, Kohl, Genscher, and the German political elites, fearing any suspicion of hegemonic aspirations and resolved to avoid any new 1913 experience, finally reinforced the German propensity to prioritize the needs of international, primarily European integration, at the price of even discussing national interests other than international integration or strategic demands of leadership in Germany. This is particularly true for the European Monetary Union. It was no precondition for German reunification, but reunification accelerated the introduction of the euro without sustainably safeguarding monetary stability. A couple of weeks ago, Hans-Dietrich Genscher confessed that the mission of Germany, in other words, his or his generation's foreign politics, was to be, I quote him, the prerequisite of her neighbor's fortune, des Glückes Unterpfand seiner Nachbarn zu sein, as he said. Widespread evidence suggests that this is still a prevalent and genuine attitude within German political elites. But how then is the discrepancy between autonomized German self-integration on the one hand and these massive foreign suspicions of Germany's aspirations to hegemony and ruthless dominance to be explained? It seems to reveal still unequal standards in perception, intertwined with still unresolved structural problems of Germany's half-hegemonic material strength and her political role in Germany. Consequently, this corresponds to diametrically opposite demands on Germany, ranging from unrestricted solidarity with the Mediterranean countries on the one hand, to the appeal that it take more and vigorous leadership on the other. So, what to be done? And does history give us any orientation? The first option is to accept hegemony and consequently exert stability politics as the prerequisite for economic success. This would mean refusing further European transfer payments, urging structural reforms and further budgetary cuts in the Mediterranean countries even more forcefully, and finally envisaging either their exclusion from the monetary union or a German exit. There is some reason to believe that those politics would be appropriate in economic terms, if this is at all possible. At the same time, it would blow apart the Maastricht consensus, reverse central elements of European integration politics of the last more than 2 decades, thus basically undermining the foundation of the European Union and the post-Cold War order in Europe generally. Maybe I'm lacking imagination, but for me at least it is hardly conceivable that such a policy of consistently prioritizing national interests could end up in anything other than German isolation, Germany's diplomatic nightmare, and if not war, but incalculable confrontation in Europe. If that is to be ruled out, an alternative lies in the Mediterranean solution of more European solidarity, as it is claimed. Increased and increasingly unconditional transfer payments drawing the bazooka, as Hollande and Barroso, Samaras and Monti, Juncker and wide sections of the German political elites demand. Perhaps I'm lacking imagination again, but I think it hardly conceivable that such solidly united politics, contrary to all patterns of German economic success, would end up in anything other than economic devastation and inflation, the other German nightmare, reversing the Maastricht consensus as well and ultimately smashing the European treaties, transferring power to institutions never legitimized, and, by the way, slaughtering the dairy cow. An obvious predicament without satisfactory solutions. as is history. But if there is any lesson from history, it is, or it may be, the experience that the combination of national interests and international integration has been the most effective way of handling the German problem in Europe. Given the already confessed lack of imagination, sailing between Scylla and Charybdis may be the safest course to be adopted, a safe trip not to be underestimated in history, following a direction of both upholding stability politics and accepting leadership, as well as keeping international integration and awareness of others' perspectives and needs, constantly trying to find a balance and getting through. Since I announced to stretch the German question from Kaiser Wilhelm to Angela Merkel, what now about her? Atypically rationalist in style and less rooted in an ideological pro-European habit, basically this seems to be her direction, even if she doesn't really explain it, and even if her politics are wavering and highly changeable. A German observer called it the Clint Eastwood principle, riding into town and looking to see what happens. At least, German politics hardly seem to follow a really strategic approach, thinking in contingencies and alternatives. After initially considering the exit of failed states from the European Monetary Union, she shifted to if the euro fails, Europe fails, when the Rubicon was crossed in May 2010. Resolved to keep EMU, even including Greece and Cyprus, she struggles to implement safeguards of stability politics. She may hope to sit it out and overcome the crisis by implementing structural reforms in the euro countries while protecting them with European means, avoiding a race to the bottom and just gaining time. This is not to be underestimated. There is more than one historical situation when mere time and timing also would have been crucial. You never know what happens next. Just look at Germany's recent recovery against all contemporary predictions, say in 2005 or so. And if recent indications of a recreation should prove to be lasting, these politics will be praised as the rescue of Europe. If not, particularly if agreed reforms remain undone and the crisis returns, the same politics may turn out to be a mere sliding down the slippery slope, dismantling one self-erected obstacle after another, and ending up in being pulled into a European transfer union nobody has ever agreed to. However, this leads us to the verge of forecast, and prediction is, as is well known, very difficult, especially if it is about the future. This resembles the insight of a great German philosopher, Sepp Herberger, who knew that football is thrilling since you never know how it will end. With one exception, perhaps, discovered by the famous British historian Gary Lineker. Soccer is a game for 22 people that run around, and in the end, Germany always wins. Even that has recently been put into perspective. So we must leave the performance of the fourth act of the German question on the European stage to a lecture by a future Gerda Henkel visiting professor. Thank you very much for your attention.
Trying to avoid blinding myself with the display. Okay, I can't see anything at all. Perfect. Nearly floored by technology once more. Okay. We have about half an hour for questions. I sort of encourage you to think of several. Let me start the proceedings, though, by asking one myself. Can I suggest perhaps that there's one further link between German unification and, if not EMU as a policy, the current situation and therefore the development of EMU? And this is something you kind of hinted at but didn't really develop, and perhaps I can push you a bit further on. And that is the link between the unenforceability of the Stability Pact within Europe and Germany's own financial troubles and trials and tribulations as a result of unification in the late 1990s and early 2000s. In other words, Germany, who saw themselves throughout the Maastricht negotiations as the sort of the apostle of financial rectitude and budgetary discipline, temporarily found themselves in the late 1990s and early 2000s at precisely that moment when the European rules were being devised and were first having to be implemented, in a position where actually it too was facing serious budgetary difficulties. And in a sense, that drove made a major hole in the whole Maastricht bargain and post-Maastricht bargain on which EMU was meant to rest. So perhaps if you can tackle that, and then we'll open the floor to other questions.
Yeah, this is the question of the history of the German stability politics, which, even if you have a closer look to the negotiations in Maastricht, is somewhat wavering. So the real apostle of German stability politics was German Finance Minister Gerhard Stoltenberg. And there is one, but he was Minister of Finance no longer than 1989, when he was replaced by Theo Weigel, who was much closer to Helmut Kohl. So this was somewhat the first breach, the first break within the really consistent German stability politics founded by the finance ministry as well as the Bundesbank. So Weigel was much closer to Kohl and much more willing to compromise, since Genscher was even more. So this was the first thing, but even Weigel was struggling for the Stability Pact in 1996, and which was implemented in 1997. And the Germans would have liked the Stability Pact to be tougher than it turned out to be, and was resolved in 1997. So even Weigel, until the end, adhered to this kind of stability politics. And even then, the German situation was worsening, since the economic problems in Germany mounted in the late 90s. They got better around 2000 and worsened again in 2003 and 2004 at the end of the Rödder government. So at least, to say it that way, German Christian democratic politicians point at the Social Democrats. And there might be a part of the answer might indeed lie in the political orientation, meaning that Social Democrat or the Rödder government might have been more prepared to break the Stability Pact than Christian liberal government would have been done. So what you suggest might be the one part of it, the severe economic difficulties of Germany on the one hand, but a kind of political orientation in Germany, I think, is the other part of the answer.
Thank you. Okay, I can see lots of hands. We have a roving microphone, so if you're picked, can you please wait until the microphone gets to you before asking your question? Yes, the gentleman on the right there.
We hear a very great deal in recent times about the need for closer European political and fiscal union as a solution to the dog's breakfast we now have in the European monetary zone. Could you tell us what the Germans mean by political and and fiscal union. Do they really mean that, or do they just mean a tighter regime to make sure the Southern Europeans keep within their budgets and do what they're told?
Shall we collect?
Yes, let's collect two or three first. Yes, just behind there. Yes.
There is an increasing desire by Britain and its people to withdraw from the European Union and the associated European Court of Human Rights, but a reluctance of the government to allow us to do this. Do you think that the underlying reason is fear of a German military resurgence? Finished.
What resurgence?
Military resurgence. Okay, and yes, in the middle here. The microphone may struggle to get across, but can you pass it over? And then.
In spite of what you say, I still don't understand how a new currency could be set up without a single monetary policy, fiscal policy for Europe, and nor, the only safeguard that was created when the euro was set up was the Stability Pact, which Germany and France then fairly soon proceeded to breach. Sure, why was this basic precondition for a stable currency not understood and implemented absolutely seriously? I still don't understand that.
Okay, there'll be another round of questions, but we need to give our speaker a chance to respond.
Yes, since these are very interesting questions requiring answers. Just to begin with the question of the British fears, I can't really speak for the British government, but
a few of us can.
But it's not my impression that these fears are as strong as they have been during the Thatcher government. And if you have a look to the political positions at the moment, they are not far away from another. So if you have just a look to this, what for Merkel and David Cameron are talking about today, the question of the European budget, the German and the British positions originally are quite close. But it's a question. The question is much more that of the general orientation, much more detached British orientation. Cameron saying less Europe is something, at least up to the moment, completely unthinkable, unperceivable to say in Germany. You never know what happens, but up to now, at least political elites in Germany are fiercely resolved to stick to the euro, to stick to the European Union, and the only critics being a really silly coalition in Germany from the really socialist left party on the one hand, and the much more right-wing Peter Gaulweiler from the Bavarian Christian Social Party. This is bringing up really interesting combinations in Germany. But the question, the first and the third question, I think, do belong together, since they hint to the same problem. What is meant by political union? And this is a very, very good question. I think it hints to a widespread lack of real concepts of Europe. To start with Helmut Kohl, when he spoke about the political union, it was not really clear what he meant in 1989 and 1990. It was more or less giving more rights to the European Parliament, perhaps a president of the European Commission elected by the European Parliament or by the European populations, strengthening democratic rights and implementing more efficacy of the European institutions. That more or less was the idea. Of course, political union never really completely clear. The French refused that in order not to transfer any kind of state sovereignty to Europe on the one hand. On the other hand, what the French favored was the idea of a gouvernement économique. So this is very, very much nearer to this what is discussed at the European finance minister within the European monetary zone now. So you never know, and so the question I think is part of the answer. You never know what is meant by European political union. Is it rights of the parliament? Is it a strengthening of the commission on the one hand, or is it just implementing the fiscal pact implementing the fiscal pact as was resolved by the Stability Pact in 1979. I think, on the other hand, this unclearness is part of the European way of finding consensus. Since you need this kind of vagueness and unclearness just to find any kind of compromise between positions which are drifting apart. This is on the one hand part of the European success story, on the other hand part of the European misery story, since you find compromises which are formula compromises in the end. So it's not really clear what's meant by political union. It's not really clear how to implement then the monetary union, and now getting to your question. Since, on the one hand, many participants of the monetary union were not prepared to hand over state sovereignty to any kind of institutionalized monetary union. So the idea then was to agree on the fiscal pact. And the idea behind it is, as I said, is just to be explained with this cultural difference of Germans establishing rules and trusting that rules are obeyed. This is a specific German tradition. Most of the time it works, not every time, but most of the time. But the idea was, we do these regulations and this will work. That there might be anybody to accept regulations and to do something different was not comprised in the German view of the things.
The Germans then broke it.
The Germans then broke it. This is the real irony of it. But it's not the regular case, and at least this I think really was not envisaged in 1997 by Weigel and the Kohl government. I think this would have been pretty imperceivable for the Kohl government in the end, since they really struggled hard in order to bring Germany to the Stability Pact. But on the other hand, I think what you both asked is to be explained by the severe preordination of political reasons. The euro was a political project, and at one point or another, Kohl, at least with reunification, was resolved to ignore economics and to become, say, ideologically resolved that the euro must be a success.
Okay, let's move the mics over to this side of the room for a moment. As we've only got the one, you'll need to be patient. Yes, here in the sort of fifth row. Milord, this here.
Yes, I just wanted to take up really your last remark. I mean, it seems to me one element in the explanation of extraordinary risk-taking is this was a period when Kohl in particular was dominant and had taken enormous risks which had paid off with unification. Yeah. And he was in a mood for the great throw, throwing the dice. Mm-hmm. And it went on then with the expansion of the European Union eastwards, which was another enormous degree of risk-taking. In other words, it seems to me we had an extraordinary situation where you had a Chancellor who had not been dominant before, emerging as dominant, with some very sort of clear ideas of a very simple, even simplistic kind, and able to push them through. It seems to me the real loser in this is Mitterrand, because he got what he wanted, but it didn't work. I mean, we're back with your fundamental problem of the strength of the German economy, now because it's extraordinarily efficient and productive, and that creates really the problem. And you can no longer devalue your other currencies in order to make that good. So it seems to me that the story is really of a careless idealism on Kohl's part and a cunning on Mitterrand's part, because after all, not all European countries wanted it. Thatcher, in a sense, quite rightly, said no, this isn't going to benefit us. Why should we have monetary union? And it was open to Mitterrand, seems to me, to see the same thing, that he was so fixed by the idea of breaking the Deutschmark that he basically trapped himself and a lot of other countries in his own petard.
Okay, a few rows back on the left there.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the outstanding presentation. I couldn't agree more, actually. I have two questions, one related to the French role in 2010 and in how far it resembled the French role in the late 1980s in terms of pushing Germany towards a certain French position. And the second question would be, you also hinted at the narrative in Germany that German interests are equal to European interests, but I mean, I regard it really as a narrative by the political elite towards the population. In how far do you think this narrative, which also links back to German history, etc., is actually sustainable in the long run? Thank you.
Okay, and one last question of this round. Okay, yes, here down in the front. I will do this side of the room in a moment with one roving mic. It makes sense to concentrate geographically.
Could I just ask you, looking forward on Europe, when I look to see that the idea, or rather the concept of Europe was to try and create employment, when I think the current figures are somewhere between 16 and 20 million unemployed across Europe and rising, and we have the case of the Irish who are having to subject and present their budget to the European Parliament before they can present it to their own people. There seems to be a constant fudging of the rules at the higher level and completely ignoring the wishes of the normal people, of the average person in Europe. Do you think this is good democracy, and where will it lead us to?
Okay, plenty to be getting on with that.
Yeah. To start with the last one, I meant to have realized kind of a bias in your question. This again attaches to the first questions we had, since the establishment of new institutions is pretty unclear. And if you just have a look to the German situation, which in terms of the budgetary implications, we have a judgment by the Federal Court regarding the Lisbon Treaty in 2009, which told the German government the limits of European integration, and there was a very clear-cut stopgap, which was erected by the Federal Court in terms of fiscal politics. So the problem is the fiscal pact is pretty problematic in constitutional terms, for example, in Germany. And of course, this is one question of a constitutional question. The other question is the question of democracy. And indeed, we are heading toward the question. It is again the question for the political union. Now we are establishing tighter regulations for the fiscal pact on the one hand, which is part of institution building. On the one hand, without, on the other hand, increasing any kind of democratic regulation or democratic control within Europe. And indeed, what we see is another discrepancy between the European institutions, which is due to a development which doesn't derive from any founding act of the European Union, but from constantly changing and developing already existing institutions, adding others, and so building one part after another without designing a concise construction of a European constitution. Including that the Maastricht Treaty and the monetary union is basically changed just within the process. So would like to underline what you say, that these problems are obvious. So now the question for reunification and the narratives. I think this belongs together, since I just would like to support what you said, and I just would add another thought myself, since what you said in reunification could be added by the question of the German monetary union, which is quite interesting. I just left this out in my talk. Since if you have a look to the positions in advance of the Maastricht Treaty, There was the French so-called monetarist position, which is pretty irritating because it's a complete difference from what is called monetarist in terms of economic science. But the French position to do the institutions first and to look for coherence then. This is the monetarist position, and the economist position, the German position, was the hard currency countries' position was to look for economic coherence first and to build the institutions then. If you have now, and then with EMU, the French position more or less was adopted, apart from the fiscal, the criteria, the stability criteria. So if you have a look to the German monetary union in 1990, it was completely the other way around from that what the Germans demanded in Europe. The German monetary union between East and West Germany from July 1990 meant was a very prominently monetarist economic union, building the economic union right away and looking for economic coherence thereafter. The economic experts, as well as the Bundesbank, told Kohl that this never would work. And this might be another part of Kohl's self-confidence to have overcome these contradictions and these positions as well in creating a monetary union, and might have empowered him even more for his European politics. Now the questions for the narratives, because I think it's important. This kind of boosting self-confidence of Kohl is the one thing, and the implementation of narratives in the 80s, of narratives which weren't questioned at all in Germany. I think are pretty important in terms of giving self-confidence to politicians taking a huge risk they never could oversee. So this was a kind of immunizing strategy, and the first of these narratives was, as I told you, the narrative of peace, the European peace story, the success story of European self-civilization, finding peace between the European nations. This is still lasting, and it has been added in the last years by another narrative, the narrative that of the sufficiently great area of a monetary union. This narrative says that in the global
competition.
In the global competition, that in the global competition of the 21st century, sufficiently large areas are required, and that Europe just can survive by building a sufficiently large area. This reminds me at the theories of Weltreichslehre in the early 19th century, which was the same way of thinking about things. Today we mock at that, but I think it should make us a bit more humble in looking at these narratives which are working right now. So the question you asked, whether these narratives will be sustainable. What is to be observed is that they have started to lose credibility. In Germany, people have started to question it, which hasn't been the case 5 or 10 years ago. So, if I'm asked for the future, I'm a historian, and what I said about forecast is still valid. But I think what we have to envisage as historians is the experience that things change, and that they change in an unexpected way. So I wouldn't dare a forecast about that, but I wouldn't maintain that these narratives will last just because they have lasted for a couple of decades.
Do you think we're travelling in the right direction?
This is a political question I would like to leave for the wine afterwards.
Okay, at least. Probably time for a couple more questions, possibly 3. Yes, the gentleman on the right here.
Thank you. I want to bring it back to a properly historical discussion. And you did draw this parallel with the Kaiser Reich. you will remember, I'm sure, Max Weber's famous critique, notably in his lecture, Politik als Beruf, of what had gone wrong with the Kaiserreich, how Bismarck had deprived the German people, really, of political maturity, and a kind of unquestioned nationalism had taken over. What he wanted to create was a genuine democracy. Well, of course, we know what happened in the Weimar Republic. You know, it was a democracy without democrats, and it collapsed. But it's very interesting. You quoted Kohl saying it's either monetary union or back to Kaiser Wilhelm again. Now, I want to sort of throw out a rather bold suggestion to you, which is that Kohl's role in the last few decades is actually quite comparable to Bismarck's. He did reunify Germany. He did then create a European system within which that unified Germany could thrive. But, of course, as we can now see, his successors have been unable to make this work in the way he envisaged. And I want to ask you whether there is, in fact, a sort of Weberian critique to be made of Kohl, that, he did not, by indoctrinating the people with this European ideology, which, you might call a Gesinnungsethik rather than a Verantwortungsethik, he deprived the German people of the ability to see how it would look from outside, how Mediterranean countries would see Germany's present policy, how the British would see it, and so on.
Okay, Dr. Schwab.
I would also like to ask a historical question. In terms of your postulation on the German question and how it kind of found an answer, you seem to suggest that it is self-binding, which is something that perhaps grew out of the process post-45, where it was imposed, and then Kohl kind of took it over into the 1990s and conducted self-binding, in institutional self-binding, while conducting, say, national interest in the wider European framework. And also a learning curve in terms of that it's important for Germans who are in the center of the continent to understand their neighbors' perceptions and fears and to engage with that in a constructive kind of way. How do you relate your interpretation or your postulation of that to the interpretation by Winkler, who says, well, it's all a long-term trajectory of der lange Weg nach Westen, that somehow as a sort of teleological move towards universalist Western ideas, and Germany sort of was on that trajectory as in it, and in that sense, this just will continue. Whereas you seem to suggest that, of course, there may have been a learning curve from what happened in the semi-sovereign post-45 Germany and was taken over into the sovereign united Germany, but nevertheless, we cannot be certain where things may go.
Okay, one final question right up at the top there. Sorry, Milada. Too many stairs in this lecture.
Thank you for your very thoughtful and thought-provoking analysis. Mike, I wondered if you could give us a historical comparative perspective on the German leadership and the citizens' patience to be friendly with its neighbors. And then it's a two-part question. At what cost? When will it be too much? And when I say friendly, I mean the sense that from some perspective, it feels as though French banks, other countries, were essentially riding on the coattails of, as you said, the Deutschmark and the strength of the German economy.
Okay.
Yeah, again, these things belong together. So the parallel you draw between Bismarck and Kohl is really fascinating, since we wouldn't have thought so. At least Germans wouldn't have thought so before, in terms of Bismarck on the one hand being the preserver or the re-preserver of European stability and of peace on the one hand, but on the other hand of the suppressor of a democratic development within Germany. So you could equal Bismarck to Kohl insofar as even as the European integration too hasn't produced kind of democracy, but in terms of motives it would be strikingly different. Kohl would have liked to strengthen European democratic elements. I think I would question whether the parallel would mean that the successors have lost the heritage or destroyed the heritage, since in the monetary union, obviously, and this is what we see now much clearer than before, obviously the flaws were within the system of 1990 or 1992 within the Maastricht Treaty. We already spoke about that there are the initial flaws within the system. So this, in the end, I think makes a difference, but I think the parallel is absolutely correct in the willingness of both to preserve any kind of, to preserve or to re-erect a kind of stability within a fragile context within Europe. But in both cases, you see, and even in Bismarck's case, it's not only the problem of his successors, but this Bismarckian system became precarious in the 1880s as well. So he had to deal with the interior, the systematic problems of his system as well. So the question is there the tradition or the parallel between Bismarck and Kohl, or the long way to the West, as Christina asked? I don't think that in the end there is a contradiction between Kohl's self-awareness and self-understanding on the one hand, and this long path to the West as it was maintained by Heinrich August Winkler. I think there is a common denominator between that, and this is the awareness of Kohl and his generation, and Heinrich August Winkler belongs to it, of this West German success story. The idea of now reaching to the West, of having realized this success story of security, stability, and prosperity in 40 years of the German Federal Republic. This got to the top in 1999. This again was the question of the boosting Kohl. West German self-confidence was on its top level in 1989 when West Germany celebrated the 40th anniversary of the Federal Republic of Germany. Still, the problem was the unsolved question of national unity, which faded in the 80s. But when the Federal Republic celebrated its 40th birthday in 1989, in a period of really booming economy, which was the background for German reunification as well as for the Maastricht Treaty, or at least the preparations for Maastricht, this is the background for these great transformations and German politicians ready for the transformation of German reunification as well as European unification. So I think these transformations in Europe on the German side were driven by this kind of boosting German self-confidence out of the self-perceived West German success story. I think this drove German politics, and part of it was then this self-asserted history of the European peace story in combination with what Walter Hallstein, I think Hallstein was the one who brought up the metaphor with the European bicycle having to be moved on and on, which must not stop, or the idea of, as it I think was the formula of the treaties of Rome, of the ever closer European Union. This is all these things, the peace narrative, the ever closer union. This is the kind of self-understanding of the Germans in 1989, which drove was the background of these transformations from the German point of view. And now, the gentleman in the last but one row, I have to admit I forgot your question.
The idea of the patience, a comparison of the patience of both German leadership and potentially its citizens to continue to essentially drive the economic growth in Europe, and whether that patience will wane and at what cost.
You mean just recent patients.
Well, yes. Is it still strong? Is there still a strong conviction, as there has been, to lead?
German patience is extraordinarily strong. If you believe in the surveys, there is very much trust in Angela Merkel. Germans don't feel any kind of crisis in terms of monetary or material shortcomings in Germany at the moment. German economy is booming at the moment, and the Germans are pretty patient at the moment. Nobody knows what happens if the economic situation deteriorates in Germany. But I think in this case, not only the German elites, but the German population is resolved to experience no new 1930.
Okay. Great. Well, judging by the number of hands, we could go on and on, but I suspect it's 7 o'clock and it's therefore time to call matters to a halt here. There is, I believe, a reception up in the senior dining room at the top of the building opposite, so those of you wishing to join us there, please do make your way in that direction. But I think before we do that, we should give Professor Rödder a well-earned round of applause.